Basically, I grew up in a university town in Michigan, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and there was a lot. It was, I think, the first city in the country to have openly gay city council members. There was a early gay liberation front. There was lesbian groups. So for me, as a high school student, I could was introduced to a lot of these ideas on the university campus. So it was so it was actually pretty natural and all around me, as I came of age, so to speak.
Yeah, and I guess I was kind of came through the left. I mean, it was the tail end of the 1960s and early 70s, so I became involved in the left, and through the left became involved in the feminist movement and came out through the feminist movement, through being involved in the feminist movement, I'd say. But but we started working together because Greta had started working in the very early 80s on a film that eventually became the film Before Stonewall. And I started working, she was the director of the film, and I started working on it doing research, because I had a background in research. So that's when we first started working together, would be, I'd say, early 80s.
Where we actually met was at a group called Women Make Movies, which was an organization of feminist filmmaking and distribution cooperative, I guess, whatever. And so I was making films with the Department for the Aging, and Andrew was in distribution, right?
Yeah, I was organizing a women's film festival in
Right.
the early 80s
Right.
in New York.
That's right. I started developing the idea and beginning the process of the research for Before Stonewall in like 1981 or 82, and that was the time of Anita Bryant and the blowback against LGBT active. At that time, it was just lesbian and gay activism, and fighting for equality, and but I was thinking about that the other day when you said what the topic was, that the Stonewall riots and the birth of the modern gay movement was 1969. So it was only 13 years after that I started doing the work on Before Stonewall. And I thought, wow, that's a very short time, to actually have the chutzpah, the idea of doing something on how the evolution of how did lesbian and gay communities form and lead to such a radical act, which gave birth to an actually activist movement of what we now call the GLBT movement. And I was always very interested in histories and uncovering unknown histories anyway. And at the time, there were quite a few films like films about women in World War II, Rosie the Riveter, films about the Lincoln Brigade, people who had gone to Spain to fight on behalf of the Republic. There was, what were some other like films about women's history and leftist history that had not been told before. And I was very intrigued by that, which is what led me to want to make Before Stonewall, was to find out the history of my own sort of identity.
I was always interested in history as well. I mean, I think at the time, just had a kind of natural inclination for history. I later actually became a historian, but I was really interested in finding those hidden stories that really changed the narrative of, what we think of as kind of collective history, the stories that were written out of it. And so when Greta started working on Before Stonewall, it was kind of natural fit for me to want to be involved in doing some of the research for it. I didn't really have a background in filmmaking. I kind of came to filmmaking through, doing research and working on some other productions, and then eventually became a director. But it's not like I didn't go to film school at the time. Film school wasn't really a big entry point into filmmaking. It was more just coming through it from the left and the women's movement, and then eventually into the gay and lesbian movement. Filmmaking was kind of an outgrowth of the things I was interested in. And so that was the first film we worked on together. It turned out to be really much bigger than we ever imagined. I mean, I think we worked on it we started in 81, 82, and it was finally finished in 85, so it was a lot of years. and in many ways, it's kind of set us on a path after that of films that kind of had similar agendas. I mean, obviously, our filmmaking together and separately has evolved a lot since then, but it was kind of the beginning of a journey, you could say, that film. And you could look back at that film and you could almost trace a line between that and some of the films we did later.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, and one of the reasons that we went off and founded our own company and made our own films about, mostly, the earliest films were all mostly focused on women's history, was because it was the experience of working on Before Stonewall was not always a good one, where the men always wanted to work with women, but we were the wrong women because we had a lot of ideas and we're really articulate and we're always fighting for, you know, the female place. I'll tell you an example, like when we were doing the research for Before Stonewall, especially at that time, and still older gays and lesbians were not so comfortable talking about their own life and their own history. Men were much more comfortable than women. And so we had so many more men who we had identified as people to interview and researching photographs, that we had to argue among the producers and say, listen, no, we can't talk to any more men. I mean, we only can talk to women because we have a shortage of women's stories. And if we hadn't have done that, then Before Stonewall would have been like, 80% men, just because the men came forward, where we were like, no, we know we have to find, we know the women are there, we know the stories are there, and we have to go get them. And you still have that. I mean, you still have that all the time. But the thing about Before Stonewall is one thing led to another. Like, for example, we had known that the women during World War II, more men were in the war than women, and the women were doing domestic things in factories and doing jobs that men had left behind. And one of those was playing music, big band music. So we discovered this International Sweethearts Rhythm, which was interracial, big band, women's traveling band. And we were like, okay, that's our next film. So we didn't put that in Before Stonewall, that clip, because it was just that story was a standalone story. And then when we were doing the Sweethearts of Rhythm, we met Tiny Davis and her partner Renee Lucas, and then we were like, okay, wow, that's another story. So Tiny appears in the Sweethearts of Rhythm because the Sweethearts of Rhythm is a film about a big band, so we had to have many voices. And then Tiny became a featured person in the next short portrait of, and the thing that never always amazes me and that I found really exciting is that those two short half-hour films about women in jazz, but they're also really about empowerment of women and racism and American culture, continue to just really touch people and continue to be used and viewed and inspire people. Like for example, now there's a lot of very conservative, as you said, a more conservative backlash against all the progress we've made. And then I remember, when Tiny and Ruby were playing music and were a fairly out lesbian couple, there was no gay movement. There was no support system. There was no government subsidy. But they found a way to be who they were and to continue to survive. And I think we had to remember that. The institutions of society and government are not always going to be there for us.
I think also there's something about, you say about the documentary world was a little more flexible, I think. I mean, I never was particularly interested in going into dramatic feature filmmaking because for me, filmmaking was really a vehicle to tell the kinds of stories I wanted to tell, which had to do with real life, real people, and so on. But I do think had we wanted to go in that direction, those doors would have been closed to us. There really were not, you could count on one hand the number of women who got to make dramatic feature films in the United States, and most of those women never got to make a second one. If you were a man, no matter how successful your film was, you'd get a second chance, and that could lead to a whole career. That wasn't going to happen, and I think documentary, historically, at least in the United States, had more room for women because you had to find your own way. No one was really going to give you the money. You had to raise the money. You had to find a way forward to make your film, and you had more control over it that way. You weren't so much at
Commissioned.
the commission, you weren't at the whims of like the big powers that be, and you were also looking for a lot less money. And, you know, women are always where there's a lot less money is where women are usually thriving because they don't have access to the money. So I think that was one thing, in terms of it being maybe, it's still terrible for women directors, absolutely terrible, unbelievable how little progress has been made. But I think it's better than it was when we were starting. However, having said that, maybe that little door opened a little bit, but the climate we live in now is much more conservative. I don't think, realized that we were coming of age in a relatively liberated era. You know, the women's movement had gained some ground, the LGBT movement had gained some ground. It was this time of possibility, and we were young and thought we could do anything. Like, we thought we could make films if we wanted to make films. We could do anything. And it wasn't like a careerist thing. Like, now kids are under so much pressure. They have to find their track and find their, you know, path and get all their experience because everything's so competitive. It wasn't about a career. It was about doing what we felt passionate about. And there was a kind of feeling that you could do that. I mean, obviously we had certain privileges. We were white, we had education, you know, maybe not everyone felt that they had those options that we had, but I think in retrospect, like looking back now from an older age, I think we were very lucky to come of age then, because I think things are actually, doors have closed. Like, there's so much backlash against the women's movement now. There's probably more backlash than there was forward movement, you know, for example. It's only with hindsight that you could actually kind of evaluate the time you're living in and realize, like, the things that maybe you take for granted at the time. But I definitely see that we are in a much more conservative time than we were.
When Before Stonewall was released in England, I became friends with the distributor, Ben Gibson, who now runs the Berlin German Film School. And and then I applied for a Fulbright. I went to England for my Fulbright for 6 months, and Andrea came. We stayed 12 years, and so we made many films, co-productions with European and South African. But we were always still interested in the history of the subculture, the non-dominant history, and again, England had a wonderful Channel 4 television, and there were many subsidies for film production, and so we were able to do co-productions with European countries on, well, Andrea made Escape to Life, and we made Paris Was a Woman in that time, and Seed of Sarah, and some other movies. I have to look at my own. I have to look at my website. I can't remember right now. But we made a lot of movies in that period of time.
And also, we had moved out of the United States. I mean, Paris Was a Woman, you could say. It's set in France, but we really looked at the American colony. It wasn't exclusively American, but we did look at the American experience in Paris in large measure because we were American exiles and we were drawn to how these women had lived their lives and kind of getting, I don't know, they were inspirational to us. But we were no longer living in the United States, and we had lived in London, we lived in Berlin, more recently we lived in Barcelona. So we were interested in stories that we were uncovering when we were there, you know. I mean, I think our outlook became much more global in certain ways.
Yeah, and you know, when I look, it's like when I was in South Africa for the first Gay and Lesbian Film Festival in 1985, I guess it was. It was right after the election of Mandela.
The 90s.
Okay, 90s. Okay, see, I don't even know what
Mandela was in prison in the 80s.
Well, when were the first democratic elections in
94.
Okay, so right after that, they had the first Gay and Lesbian Film Festival, and I went. They had like a mini retrospective, but somebody from the BBC Radio interviewed me, and then we sort of became friendly, and then he said, you know, I have this great story. I need a filmmaker to work with. And he's a journalist. Now he's a very prominent journalist in Johannesburg, but Mark Gavisser. So he told me the story about the man who was with Nelson Mandela when he was arrested, and he happened to be a white, gay, working-class theater director. And I was like, wow, no one remembered him except the immediate comrades who are still alive, from that period. And so I said, that's a fabulous story. And we can look at the whole subculture of gay life and the question of apartheid at the same time. So we did that film together. So that's how the films evolve. You meet people, places, and find things that you want. You find stories that you are compelling enough to spend several years of your life researching and telling. I mean, looking at 35 years of life and thinking about perspective. I think for one thing, the visibility and the sense of community was, there were fewer numbers of, people who identified as gay and lesbian, so there were smaller communities and maybe more cohesive. And then also the depending on the country, depending on the place, people were, like, say in Germany, the movement was not about being integrated into a bourgeois society with the whatever the socialization process of that was, but it was rather about creating an alternative sense of identity and lifestyle. And that has shifted, like, all over the world. There's very little of that left. People may dress a little bit differently or, have tattoos or a certain dress style, but basically the drive has been shifted mostly to acceptance into the existing system, which is a pretty big change in a very short period of time.
And also, I think there was a real shift, like whether you're looking at Berlin or London or New York. I mean, those are the cities we really knew well in the 90s because we lived in London and Berlin. We're from New York. There was a real shift in the 90s from it being a kind of the LGBT movement having a radical agenda to it being recognized as a great target for consumerism. Because in general, the LGBT community had money to spend and could be targeted by marketing and the whole capitalist system. So as a result of that, I think, once that community was tapped for as a kind of niche marketing, there was a general, maybe slow and reluctant, but drag to the right from where it had been. And I think in general, the whole notion of wanting to fit in and be accepted and have the same lifestyle, have the marriage and the house and the kids and the package, became more and more attractive to LGBT people. I mean, I don't think that was ever a desire in the early days of gay liberation. No one wanted that. We wanted to be different from that. We wanted to reject that. Little by little, obviously, the LGBT community is huge, and there's a spectrum. And there are people on the far left, and there are people on the right, and there are people in the middle. And, but in general, I think the whole consumerism culture has really influenced the LGBT community and pulled it a little bit more into this conformity place.
I think in the beginning when we were younger, these things we trusted each other, and we each had, we might work on the same film, but we had different skill sets, whatever. And then as we sort of matured and got more interested in different topics or wanting to do things, wanting to have, sometimes I had like Andrea was like a producer. We're always producer or co-producers on each other's work. That is not commissioned work. And a lot of that is because we have the company that produces it together, and also because we talk about everything. I mean, we talk through ideas, argue out, a lot of arguing out of ideas and concepts. And I think being able to argue with someone that you trust is really the key. That you don't just acquiesce and just say, and then, people sometimes who've noticed a long time make fun of us. So we're still arguing over the same thing that we started arguing about 25 years ago. But in different forms, and it permeates in different ways, But I mean, in general, I would say Andrea does have an academic background. She has a PhD in history. So she has a more, like an academic kind of approach, I would say, to the films that she wants to do. And I have a more sort of instinctual, more sort of popular kind of approach. If you could say, if you were going to just break down stereotypically two different kind of ways, you know. But she always makes fun of me, like if we're doing research, like or something in the library. Like I find everything interesting. She's like, no, you have to pick when you're doing research. You have to like follow the trail. You can't just take. It's not a potpourri, you know. So the personality differences, I suppose, is. I would say we're a powerless couple, though, not a power couple.
I was going, where's the power? Please, we could
Yeah.
use some. But yeah, I mean, I think when you start out on doing, it was natural for us to work together. We had similar interests, and but I mean, at a certain point, we also had separate interests, and we wanted to work on separate projects. So in some cases, we worked with other people, like Greta worked with Mark Visser on this film in South Africa. I was involved in it. I don't remember even if I was a co-producer or line producer. I was something on it. I don't remember my credit. But Greta was the executive producer on Escape to Life, which I made with Wieland Speck from Berlin. So we've kind of tried to support each other's projects, but we haven't necessarily collaborated on everything because it's too much in a relationship to have that kind of everyday, really tight collaboration on something, and then you also living with someone. We also have a child that we're raising, and it's too much. But we have our production company that we formed 35 years ago, and that's kind of one of our children. And so we have to, if we're working on a project through our company, it's inevitable that in some way or other, we're both involved in a project. But I would say in the case of Bones of Contention, it's my project. In the case of Mandela, The Man Who Drove Mandela, it's Greta's project. So we kind of, each project has slightly different parameters, and we work it out. But sometimes we have if someone, was just over eavesdropping on our conversation, sometimes we have crazy conversations. So Greta will be on about her project, and as soon as she takes a breath, I'll jump in with, well, what about, and change it over to, let's talk about my project, And she's like, no, because we're always working on stuff. I mean, it's never like I'm taking a break while she's doing something, We're both always working. So sometimes we need each other's input and attention. And, but I don't know, we found a way to make it work.
But I've been thinking about the question of collaboration and mentorship. I think in many ways we mentored one another because I certainly had no mentorship as a filmmaker. My initial mentors, or the people who embraced my early work, were mostly gay men. There were no women programming festivals. There were no women producing films. It was, so the people who bonded with me and took me under their wing were gay men, and they all died of AIDS. So I lost my entire support mentorship network within, 2 or 3 year period. So that was really a devastating thing to have happen. So then I think we sort of mentored each other. I mean, we had mentorship in a political sense of women, and in a, respecting the research of feminist scholars whose work we relied on. But we didn't have mentorship in terms of navigating a film industry and, raising funding. So we had to, in a way, be each other's mentors. And I'm very aware of that now, so that as I travel the world, and I always try and have, some young women as part of the crew to mentor them. So that's very important to me, because I think still women have a harder time asking for and receiving mentorship than men. In general, of course, there's always exceptions, but in general.
We lived in Barcelona in 2011 and 12, and I came across this historical memory movement. I mean, of course I knew about the Franco era, but I didn't really realize the extent to which people were still today trying to get some kind of justice for what happened in that time period. And in 2011 and 12 was also the bank crisis in Barcelona. There was massive unemployment. They were starting to charge tuition for university. There were so many pressing economic problems that it really impressed me that people were out demonstrating for this thing that we don't even have in the United States called historical memory. Just this concept that history matters, that we need to remember it and acknowledge what happened. And I was really drawn to that as a historian, but just also as an American who I'm always frustrated by the lack of interest in history in my country, and here were these people for whom the history was so urgent and important. And so I got drawn into that, to learning about more about that. And to be honest, I also was trying to figure out a way that we could move back to Barcelona because we were only there for 1 year, and we loved living there, as everybody does. And so I had this idea of applying for a Fulbright to go back to Spain because I had to return to New York where I was teaching, and was lucky enough to get the Fulbright. So I was like, okay, Greta, I got the money, we got to make the film, you know. But I was interested in that, but I was really, of course, because of who I am and my whole body of work, I was really interested in where's the LGBT story in this. It has to be there. It's completely erased. First of all, the whole Franco era has been erased. I mean, no one's even talking about all these missing people, you know, lying along the roadsides and ditches in unmarked graves, which was kind of spooky to realize. Like, you travel around Spain and they're just like dead, unmarked mass graves, mountains of unmarked mass graves all along the roadsides. So that alone was kind of unsettling, the idea that no one talked about this. But then the LGBT story in that was completely doubly erased. So I started trying to find out about it, and I realized that's where the heart of my film was going to be. I'm trying to find that story. And I was lucky enough to find this one man, Anthony Ruiz, who lived in Valencia. He lived in a little village outside of Valencia, and he also was trying to, I mean, he had no training, he wasn't a historian, he wasn't a journalist, he was just a person who had been a victim of the last part of the Franco era. And it was so crazy to me that here was someone who was a victim of Franco, whose whole life had been derailed by what happened, and he was younger than I was. I mean, that's how recent it was. He was younger than I was. It was in the 70s that this happened to him. So he had started this organization of people who had been imprisoned under Franco or in some way, you know, hospitalized or imprisoned or tortured in some way or killed in some instances. And so he was my entry point into doing the research. Of course, he didn't know the lesbian story. He didn't really have any, but he had a network of, the name of his association was former social prisoners. And social prisoners meant they weren't political prisoners. The people who were of course they were political prisoners, but at the time they were labeled social prisoners, which were just people who were antisocial, people who committed crimes, people who were rapists or murderers. You know, gay people were thrown in with them in prisons. So they were termed social prisoners to distinguish them from political prisoners who were leftists, who were against the regime. And what happened, of course, was after Franco died and there was the transition to so-called democracy, it was a negotiated transition. And the people from the Franco regime were still in power. And there was an agreement to not bring up the crimes of the past because would start a whole new civil war. And so what happened is that the political parties on the left that had been illegal under Franco were then legalized, and they negotiated to release the political prisoners. But all the LGBT people in prison were not in the category of political prisoners, so they weren't released, and no one negotiated for them. And they just languished there, like Sylvia Reyes in my film. She was in prison many years after Franco died. No one fought for her. No one. So this legacy of what happened, like, carried on way beyond actually Franco's death. People think about the crimes of the Franco regime. They think of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. They don't think about like 1972 and 75 and 84 when Sylvia was still in prison. You know, so it was incredible to me, this whole current of oppression that carried on, that people denied actually existed. So that was really the story I wanted to tell. But on the other hand, you know, I use the word victims. I don't think of them as victims. They're really survivors, and they have an important story to tell. And I feel like young people today can learn a lot from that story because, you know, we could easily be living in times like that again, especially in the direction things are going. The film's going to open in cinemas in September. So the only press, the only media that's been about the film in the Spanish press came after it premiered in Berlin, and there was a lot of press about it. Partly because the whole LGBT angle on the story's never been talked about, but also because Lorca is such a popular figure. I mean, he's their icon, he's their most famous figure. And so the fact that the film deals with Lorca and everyone claims Lorca for their own purposes. So on the one hand, he's the face of the new Spain, the post-Franco, the liberated Spain. On the other, he's the alternative figure, he's the gay icon, and so because it's about Lorca and deals with the debates about whether or not he should be looked for, whether he should be left alone, there was press immediately after its screen in Berlin about, specifically focusing on Lorca. And I think that press helped a lot to get a distributor that wants to open it in cinemas in Spain. So I didn't really have any other, the only other thing I could say is I definitely came up against, when I was making the film, liberal, or say mainstream liberals in official capacities who really didn't see the need to talk about this. Like, you could just...
Yeah, they want to move forward.
You could just be
not
quiet
backward.
about this now.
Yeah.
A little bit like, who are you, an American coming up here stirring up everything, causing trouble? Not so rudely, but, there was a little bit of that. Like, why do you, feel the need to,
Dig up our dirt. Yeah, why
dig up
did you?
our dirt. Yeah.
Why did you feel the need that you could do?
I'd be happy
that?
if a Spanish person would do it, but no one was doing it, so I had to do it. But I've made films in Hungary that deal with a very unpleasant past of the Hungarians during the Holocaust. I've made films in Germany about Erika and Klaus Mann and their life during the early Nazi period, so I really didn't have a problem going into another country. That's one of the great joys of being a documentary filmmaker, is you don't have to just you get to learn about all these other cultures and immerse yourself in them. I do an enormous amount of research, so I don't feel like I'm just going in there naively and somehow making a judgment on, I'm not interested in making a judgment. I'm interested in really trying to understand something that's happened and make sense of it as best I can. My interest was absolutely to support the efforts of the historical memory movement, and especially as pertains to the LGBT angle. And in fact, I feel like I introduced these groups to each other. Mm-hmm. So now there's much more of a chance of the LGBT story really being included in the whole human rights struggle instead of being its own separate little thing. There's a much bigger chance. Like now the historical memory movement has done these tributes to Lorca as a symbol, and I met Emilio Silva, who's the founder of the historical memory movement. He's kind of the accidental founder of the historical memory movement, because all he wanted to do was find his grandfather's remains and bury him next to his grandmother. And it started everything. Like, all these people came from far away. And
Don't tell your whole story of your movie.
I won't tell, but I'm saying I met him, and he has been blacklisted, meaning unable to find a job, unable to be employed ever since he did this. This is how much Spain does not want to look at its past.
Pervasive.
He does not want to look at its past. So it's interesting, because when I met him, just about almost every single thing he said, I have a very long interview with him, I couldn't use everything. Almost everything he said I agreed with. Like, I felt like he gave voice, I aligned myself with his perspective a lot. Like, I really understood what he was saying and felt a lot of sympathy for his position. And so, yeah, when I was making the film, I really wanted to see if the film in any way could support not just him. Now it's a whole grassroots movement, but he was the one who started it. Support those efforts, because the UN, the United Nations, has demanded that Spain look at this past, and the Spanish government said, no, we're not looking at it. And they've made it really difficult for anybody in Spain to try and get anywhere. So, I don't know, it's not just that I made a film for academic purposes to put in an archive, this happened. It's really definitely
engage in contemporary.
Definitely to get people to start talking about these things, to break the silence that's been around them and get people to start talking, even if they disagree, and to support the efforts of the historical memory movement, and also really, it's really important for me that the LGBT story be written into the larger human rights struggle and not be like this isolated little thing that nobody cares about.
The sort of genesis of the film Paris Was a Woman was that, I mean, I had known about, through the second wave of feminism, feminist scholarship, even before, earlier than Cherry Benstock even. Like even when I was in high school and college, there was a reclaiming, a celebration of, say, Gertrude Stein, Alice B. Toklas, a little bit of Sylvia Beach. I didn't know Adrienne Monnier. Of course, Genet was still writing for the New Yorker magazines, but I didn't know that she was a central part of this lesbian subculture that, you know, was part of the actual founding of modernism in Paris. I didn't know that. But a friend of ours, Mark Finch, was an English friend, was working on Channel 4 Channel 4 was a new television station. They were specifically mandated to tell stories of they were funding independent production companies to tell stories that weren't being told on mainstream television in England. Wow, that's like an amazing idea. That's nowhere does that exist anymore in the world. So Mark wrote to us or called us or whatever. I think in those days you picked up the phone and talked to someone. And he said, you know, we want you to put in a proposal because this is we want you to, you know, do something. So we wrote this little proposal about exploring this topic. And it wasn't selected. We didn't do it. But it got us thinking a lot about it. And then, so we were able to get research funds to go and actually do the research in the archives in Paris and in the Beinecke Rare Book Room where Gertrude Stein's papers are. And then we, of course, the Women of the Left Bank, the Sherry Benstock sort of seminal book, and then Kate Stimson's work on Gertrude Stein. All these things we started, it was just we loved the story, and it was such a great story, and it was was so sexy and so empowering. So we started to do the research, and it became very clear. It became clear very early on there was way too much for just the movie, and Andrea wanted to tell more in other stories that she could go more into in the book. So I became the director of the film. I may have been the director from the beginning. I just can't remember. And Andrea was so she did most of the research and the writing of the book and the writing of the film. And then that's interesting. It's this question of mentorship because it was not really fashionable at the time that I made that film to include any experts' historical perspective. You were just like supposed to almost put a contemporary spin on the past. But I was very conscious of the fact that I almost called her Audrey Rich, Catherine Stimson, who was the founder of Signs, and Sherry Benstock, who wrote Women of the Left Bank. Did I have any other experts in that film? I don't think so, just those two. I really wanted to acknowledge that it was their original research which rekindled an interest in this period and acknowledged the importance of these women at that time. So I put them into the film. And that was the one criticism I got. That was the only thing that people criticized about the film was why did I put these historical experts in? And I was like, because I felt they also, in the same way that these women were lost to history, I wanted to acknowledge that without the work of Catherine Stimson and Sherry Benstock, then my work wasn't possible. That was so important. It still is important for me to acknowledge, you know, what builds on what my identity, what my work builds on. Things don't come out of a vacuum, you know. So that was important, and that was a really fun movie to make because you really got to go into the lives of these people who you really almost felt like they were old friends. You felt like I felt like I knew them by the end of the movie. I think that history is very often told by the victors. the people who win whatever the struggle is, who then rule the world. And I think that that's a really inaccurate view of history, because I think that history, that all the different strands of history, like not just looking at the people who make the decisions that they ultimately, but the people who influence the decisions, the people who do the actual work on the ground. Those, to me, it's just a really important thing. I don't know how else to be more articulate about that. I'm not being very articulate, but history does matter, which doesn't mean you live in the past. But the reason with that, if we don't know that there have been women and lesbians and gay people making contributions to history and culture, it's much harder to both learn from the past, to inform the future and the present. And I think the Gertrude Stein said it best. Let me repeat what history teaches. History teaches. And so I would like actually to go beyond that, that we can learn from the past in order to maybe not repeat some of our mistakes. And also just to, if you feel like whether you feel like you're the only one in your high school who is homosexual, or you feel like you're the only one in your town, or you're the only one in your family, and your family's going to disown you, you can look like, in many ways, I just remember we had this wonderful photograph of Gertrude and Alice standing in their garden on a shelf. And one of our relatives, I won't say who, came into our apartment and said, "Why do you have that picture there? It looks like it's a family photograph." And we said, "It is. It is a family photograph. These women are our family line as much as our bloodline." So that's why it's important for me to do.
Yeah, and I would add, I think you can get a lot of inspiration and encouragement from understanding the lives of women who went before you and what they were able to do, and sometimes under much, much harder odds than you yourself are facing. These women in Paris was a woman. They left their families, they left their husbands, they weren't airplanes, they got on ships, they came to a foreign country where they didn't speak the language, and they made lives for themselves, because if they hadn't, they would have ended up living lives that were completely false to who they were. They would have been forced into marriages, child rearing, the whole package in their small towns that they came from. They didn't come, for the most part, from big cities. Alice did. She came from San Francisco, but most of them came from small towns in the Midwest. And the social pressures were so great on them to live a certain way at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s. I mean, you think things might be difficult now, imagine then. And these women had the courage to be true to who they were. And I feel like this is just one example. Paris was a woman. You could look at Sweethearts of Rhythm and say kind of the same thing. These women had the courage to chart their own path that went against the grain, and they're important for us to know about, because it makes it that much easier for us to be able to figure out how to do that for ourselves.
There's something else about diversity. I noticed it's a quite homogeneous looking culture in Slovenia, and we went to a commencement speaker, the person who speaks at a graduation of a university, at the university where we both teach, which is an incredible diverse student body from all over the world. More languages are spoken on that campus than at the United Nations, or so they say. So one of the commencement speakers was a white Italian-American young man, who wanted to work in public health. And he had people in tears. He gave this impassioned speech about how he came into the place with having grown up in a very monolithic, suburban, white, Italian-American culture, where, as he says, it's Italian-American, which means everybody eats lasagna on Sunday, but no one speaks Italian, because it's American, of course. But he talked about how being in a university and working on projects with people from vastly different understandings of the world, vastly different gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nationality, languages, class, how much it informed him as a better human being. That he could understand by working and becoming friends with these people, with other people other than from his own narrow world, he was a better human being. And he would do better work in the field of public health than if he had have stayed in his, what with it, where we go in the past that have kind of been laid up out for us. And I think that, that's just a very beautiful, kind of, for me, summary of uh, why we want to listen to and also why we want to look to the past in terms of that this is not a modern idea of of globalization, not in the neoliberal economic, capitalist sense, but in the exchange of ideas, in the exchange of values, in the exchange of understanding the histories of others, where we overlap, where we differ.
When I was making Bones of Contention, some of the stories were really hard to hear. And, I never wanted to give up, but I definitely realized that documentary filmmaking has taken me into worlds I never would have gone into otherwise, and heard some really painful stories. We started with Before Stonewall, they were painful stories, and 30 years later, more than 30 years later, I'm still making films where these stories are quite painful sometimes, not always, but I really had a renewed appreciation for the people who appear in our films and trust us with their stories. And I know that it can't always be easy to tell them, and sometimes, I had trouble getting people to agree to talk. But the ones who do agree to talk, I just feel so much gratitude because, not just because I feel like it makes my film better, but because I feel like it's important for the world to hear these stories, even though they may be painful.
And also to respect, even sometimes when I interview people or tell their stories, I don't always agree with their point of view. I don't always agree with their perspective, but I want to be respectful of it. I don't want to be a sensationalist person who takes a story and, for example, I was doing an interview for a whole new other film, and and I was interviewing an elderly African American black man, and man with great dignity, and I was talking to him about something that made him tear up, because he was talking about the most important thing of his work as a volunteer was when a little girl came and said thank you for giving her the free breakfast and gave him a flower. And so I had this grown man who's crying on camera. So I just and I knew the frame of the cameraman. And so I just let it hold for maybe 5 or 10 seconds. And then I said, okay, to the PA, could someone please give him a handkerchief? Could someone bring him a Kleenex, please? Cut. And then the cameraman was like, what are you doing? Afterwards, in private, why did you do that? That was a moment I could have zoomed right in and got this really, and I'm like, I'm not going to have a grown man with all that dignity in close-up crying on screen. I would not do that to him. So I've always had a sense of being respectful to the person who's trusting me to tell their story and something that intimate. So I have a moment you get the idea that it's emotional to him, but I'm not going to turn it into tabloid TV.
I think that as documentary filmmakers, we're not really journalists. We're doing something else, and we're somewhere between journalism and art. I don't know exactly where, but I think trying to be objective isn't really ever been our goal. I think what we are trying to do is to be fair. I would put it more in that sense. We could have many different voices in our film. They don't all agree with each other. We may have an overarching, point of view that the whole film takes our point of view, but within that there are different voices, and we try to be fair to them. I don't think we could be objective. I think there are many more than just two sides to anything. So I try to use that as a guideline of being fair. I actually, in Bones of Contention, there was something that someone said and someone else in the film didn't get a chance to answer it. And after I was really reflecting on it for a long time, I realized even though I agreed with what was said, the fact that the other person didn't get a chance to answer it was not really fair. And so I made a change in the film. But that, I think, has been more my guideline in terms of being fair to people, because it's their story. They're trusting us with their story. We're telling the story, but it's their story. And they're trusting us with their story, and the least we can do is be fair to them. We've never been to Slovenia before, so for us it's really interesting to just observe. And exciting too, because I don't think we ever imagined when we were starting out 30 years ago, 35 years ago, that we would ever be in Slovenia showing our films. And Slovenia wasn't a country, and LGBT rights didn't exist. And yeah, so I mean, it's kind of amazing to see the changes just in our lifetime. And yeah, I don't know.
And I mean, the fact that it's not a commercial pride, I hope you can maintain that, because I find the commercial aspects of pride in the major cities of America quite disturbing, where you have to pay $100 to go to the pride dance party. I'm like, you know, it just seems so, I don't know, strange to me. Yeah, I actually often think, like, I was in Barcelona a few weeks ago, and I was just walking around the Ramblas and just like, oh, I'm here, you know, and stretching my legs. And I heard this chanting, and I had seen some police gatherings, so I knew something was coming on. So then I see this gay parade, demonstration. It's Barcelona, so it's like midnight, and they're out protesting. And they come down, and they turn around the corner, and it's this really diverse men, women, mostly younger, younger to me, under 40. And they were, and then I asked someone, and I could kind of, but since most of the signs were in Catalan rather than Spanish, I kind of got I knew it was a gay thing, but I didn't really know, like, was it an immediate thing? And then I asked a young woman, I said, what's going on? She said, this is just in solidarity with people who are victims of gay violence around the world. It's not a specific thing against something that's happened recently in Spain, but more of a generic raising awareness of the anti-gay violence that is still happening, anti-LGBT violence that happens around the world, including Spain. And I actually got kind of tears in my eyes, and I thought, wow, this is fabulous. This is like, what a new world we live in, where people are out, you know, defending people they don't even know, have never met. They may have never been a victim of violence themselves. They care enough about humanity to be out in the streets on this issue. And I think, what would Sylvia Beach think? I mean, how would Gertrude Stein react if they saw this today? And then sometimes I almost feel that way. I'm like, wow, I never would have think that there would be a gay pride in, you know, Slovenia. And it's just the spread of the idea of you know, pride is really, it's very exciting. But one thing I heard about recently that I love the term, because we were talking about the Chechnya violence and then the Indonesian violence and how public it is, and how the whole culture is so deeply misogynist and homophobic that they tolerate this kind of behavior, and that how they're building. I said, oh, it's like the Underground Railroad, having to sneak people out. And they said, yeah, it's the Rainbow Railroad. And I was like, wow, that's also phenomenal. That was very powerful.
But I think also it's nice for us as Americans to be here for Pride season. That's where it is, like, not a commercial thing, because in a way we're a little bit jaded in the United States because everything's become so commercialized. And, you know, here, because it hasn't, it feels really full of promise, like it could go in any direction. You know, it really has all this potential. Not to be co-opted by the mainstream, which has already happened in the United States in many ways. And it's interesting because we were at LGBT Pride in Barcelona, not this past June, but the one before. We were filming, and we were with the mayor of Barcelona, who's a very progressive woman, and it seemed kind of like a small demonstration to me a little, because considering Barcelona was the capital of, you know, LGBT life in Spain, if not in all of Europe. And then we learned, oh no, we're at the political pride event. There's also the more mainstream commercial event that had many more people.
Well, you have to
know?
pay to get in.
So there were two
You have to pay to get in where the
simultaneous
activities are.
Yeah, so there were two simultaneous demonstrations, but we were at the political one. We didn't realize that there was another one. But the fact there is no other one here. This is it, and it's not commercial. Yeah, I think it's great because it just means it has, you know, it can determine its own direction. It can determine its own future.